Okay, hi, this is Deanna Williston, and I'm here with,
And Hume.
and we met on a Noter style Dulcimer Facebook group, and somebody was asking about a dedicated Noter Dulcimer, and I'd never heard of such an animal, so he's brought a couple here to show us.
Yeah. Well, I'll see if I can get closer in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this particular instrument's one I made in the style of an Ozark walking stick, a
Oh,
particular style of dulcimer that was more or less invented in Arkansas. And this one is chestnut on the top and bottom and red cedar for the sides. And what is that? Walnut for the fretboard.
okay.
But I don't even have another kind of dulcimer to show you. But one of the things that's distinguishing a
Oh,
Noter style dulcimer from anything else. We okay there?
yeah, I can kind of show mine. You can see
Oh,
how,
there you go. Look how tall, relatively speaking,
yeah.
the fretboard is. This fretboard is an inch, maybe an inch and a 16th or an inch and an
Wow.
eighth tall, whereas the fretboard on your instrument is more
Yeah.
like 3/4 of an inch.
Yeah.
Some of them are even only 5/8 of an inch.
Oh my goodness.
The reason for that is so that your fingers have room to hold this stick that we call the noter. And there's a
That's
couple of different ways to hold a
Hey, look,
noter.
my McSpadden is probably closer to an inch. It's definitely deeper than the other one.
Yeah, that other one was probably like half or 5/8. That's 3/4 on a McSpad.
Which is funny that you're saying this because the Gatlinburg one, I was told to play with a noter. The McSpadden was, made for modern playing, but this has the better fretboard for it. So
Yeah. Who
okay,
knows?
so
There's all sorts of inconsistencies, let's say, in the dulcimer world, and there's a lot of folklore and fairy tales that are being touted as, you know, manifest truths.
right. Well,
uh,
that's the thing. It's a wild instrument. There's so much variety. It's not been standardized, so
right. And
it's
that's
hard to
that's
know
part of the
what to
beauty to me of the dulcimer is that
exactly. Just
it
hard to
isn't
know when you're
standardized.
investing in your first one what to do.
Right. Yeah. I have a whole article that I wrote called "I Just Bought a Dulcimer. Now What?" which explains what you should have known before you bought your first instrument, all about the shapes and the fact that shape makes no difference in the sound.
Oh,
The internal volume of the body
uh-huh.
does.
Okay.
If you compare this body, which is just right at 5 inches wide, with your McSpadden, which is closer to 7 or 8,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
That will have a deeper, more mellow sound because it's got more cubic inches under the hood, as a car guy says. Um, that's that. More cubic inches means more bass baritone response to the instrument,
Okay.
um, and that's just one of the things. The more traditional dulcimers were built with less wood. They were shallower bodied, not nearly as wide, although there are some traditional dulcimers that are very wide. The Tennessee Music Box runs anywhere from 12 to 16 inches wide,
Wow.
3 to 4 inches deep. It looks sort of like a coffee table with strings. I don't have one of those because the computer's sitting on my footstool, and I have that instead of a coffee table. But anyway, things that make a dulcimer more noter drone specific, especially that height. Let me see if I can put my hand on the other side here and you can see it. I'll do it backwards or turn it this way. I don't know if you can see close up on the hand there
Yeah.
where my finger points down as I slide up and down the fretboard, or if I hold it in a thumb on top grip, my knuckles have room to clear now as I slide up and down. If you've got just a shallow fretboard, even doing it with this, I play this way a lot, where the index finger becomes both a stop to keep the noter from running into the middle drone and the melodies and bass drone, but also because that helps me guide up and down and slide.
Right.
And the same thing with on the other end, I often play resting a little finger or ring finger and little finger here, and then I can strum. But anyway, so that's two things. Another thing that makes a difference is only three strings. Dulcimers can have, well, dulcimers have three courses of strings. A course can be one string, two strings, or even three strings. I have seen one or two 9-string dulcimers out there.
What?
Three courses of three strings. It sounds marvelous because you can never quite get all of the same string, all the same note tuned exactly the same. So there's this wonderful richness to the music.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I started out in this, like I say, 50 something years ago, we used to call a 6-string dulcimer a church dulcimer. The story was that back in the day in the hills and hollers of the Appalachians, that there were, and that there actually were, these traveling preachers who rode a mule and went from shack to shack and village to village through the hills. And when they held a church service, they didn't have much. There weren't any organs, and they used this dulcimer as a church-based, the equivalent of an organ. And so they needed something that would make a lot of joyful noise. And they discovered that 6 strings make more noise than 3 strings. Or at least, that's the theory. It turns out that there are a number of ways to change the volume of the sound that you produce. But a deeper body and that bigger body of the church dulcimer and all of that adds to that. But they used to call them church dulcimers. There weren't very many of those in the traditional world of dulcimers. There's a wonderful book called, here I go losing it. It's by L. Allen Smith. It's the pre-revival dulcimers. It's a collection of photographs of old dulcimers pre-1960, more or less. That's the the Bible that those of us that build these old instruments use to get dimensions and pictures of what they look like from the top and the side and all of that. Anyway, so we mostly go with 3 strings with the noter and drum, because fretting one string, let's see if you can even hear this.
So let's pause here and tell the viewers what's going on there. We don't know why, but the modern computer and technology in Zoom is rejecting the sweet notes of the dulcimer, the traditional sounds. We have no idea why, so we're continuing the interview even though we can't quite make out the sounds.
So we apologize, but I'm making really high noises at this point here. My point is that if you're pressing a stick down, here's the string and here's the stick, and if you're pressing down, if you're trying to press down 1, that's easy. But if you're trying to press down 2, you can get the noter off kilter, and it makes one sound different from the other and makes the overall sound not very nice.
Yeah.
So
I guess that's one of the advantages of the deeper fretboard as well, helping you to hold it more steady.
Right. It gives you the ability to press deeper and harder without getting your fingers tied up. So a lot of us that play noter and drone just use the 3 strings. Now this dulcimer, I'm going to move in real close for you there. I don't know if you can see that the single string at the top side as you're looking at it is the melody string, the one that I make the notes on. The other 2 strings are closer together as if they were a couplet, a course of strings, but those are 2 different notes. There's a middle drone and then the bass drone, which are a fifth apart in this case. Musical fifth, that's D and A, if you were tuned to the key of D. Anyway, so we have the strings they can be done that way, or you can have this dulcimer has the strings equally spaced.
Hmm.
This is modeled after a specific dulcimer made by an old boy named Uncle Ed Thomas out of Viper, Kentucky, and in that area, Hindman and Berea and all of that. And Uncle Ed spent all winter making dulcimers in his shack, and then he'd spend the summers wandering from hill to holler to hill, and stopping at cabins and selling these things. He'd have a mule full of dulcimers, you know, and a little poke bag with some grits in it and whatnot. He'd wander around and, you know, talk to people and sold his dulcimers that way. And he more or less invented this, what we now think of as the Kentucky style or hourglass dulcimer.
I've read about it, so it's great to see one done, you know, from the diagrams and all.
This is built by a friend of mine named John Knopf, Knoph. He lives in Michigan, and he specializes in building these Uncle Ed replicas. This one, I don't remember the exact model, but it's modeled. He took the measurements with the calipers and measuring tapes and all of that to the nearest millimeter. He takes measurements of these instruments and then builds the replicas. And the reason they're black is, the story goes, Uncle Ed's mama wanted her stove repainted. They didn't have electric stoves. They had cast iron stoves, and her cast iron stove got a little rusty, and Mama wanted her stove painted. Well, you couldn't just go down to the paint store and buy a gallon of paint. He ended up having to buy a 5-gallon bucket of black stove paint. And he only used about a quart or so to paint Mama's stove. So he had all this paint left over. And you don't waste stuff when you live out in the middle of nowhere, you know, 50 miles from anything. So he took to painting his dulcimers black. That's the story anyway. It makes a nice story, doesn't it?
And are those wooden tuning pegs?
Yes, these are wooden tuning pegs, exactly the same as you would have on a violin. Slightly bigger than some violin pegs, smaller than others. These are, roughly what's called a 4/4 or full-size violin peg. It's not a feature of a Noder and Drone specific dulcimer, but it's a feature of traditional dulcimers that they either have that kind of tuning peg or this kind. Now those are what are called auto harp tuning pins. They're a teeny tiny micro threaded bolt from about here down into the wood. They have, 100 threads per inch, something like that. And you drill a smaller than the pin-sized hole. And the way you install them is you set that tuning pin on the hole, and you take a hammer and go whang, and hammer it down, because what that does is it crushes the wood sideways.
Right.
And then you wang it in about half an inch, and then you start turning it with a wrench.
Wow.
And it self-threads the wood. And they make them of the traditional tuning machine styles. They make probably the easiest to tune and set, because you can get this tuning key or wrench or whatever. Some of us use a clock key, like those the clocks that are in the glass things. They have a special key that winds. You can use one of those kinds of keys or a regular auto harp tuning wrench. The other thing we builders like is that those tuning pins are like 50 cents a piece. instead of $5 or $6 or $40 each for a cube tuner. They're like 50 cents a piece, and they're less work than hand carving a bunch of pegs, because the pegs are not in square holes. The pegs are in tapered holes, and the shaft of the peg is tapered, and the two have to match, otherwise they don't tune readily.
Wow.
So anyway, those are things I like to think of as that make up a noter and drone style dulcimer, that high fretboard in particular, to really get to me, the epitome of noter and drone style sound is that high silvery sound, which unfortunately I can't make you hear. But you and I will have to work together on this and see if we can figure out some way to make the electronics work.
Yeah.
Um,
We haven't talked about the fret length yet.
Oh, the fret spacings or the length, both the length and the spacing. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if it's easier. Can you see the silver frets on the black there?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. You can see, hopefully, that the frets do not go all the way across the fretboard. They're only under the melody string. These are what we call staple frets because they look like a giant fence staple.
Yeah.
So they're not really made out of fence staples.
Okay.
Because fence staples are too rounded and too thick.
Mm.
What we do is we take a heavy gauge of music wire and 2 pairs of needle nose pliers, and we cut a length and bend the 2 legs and the flat. Now, the reason that they're only the frets are only under the melody string is that in traditional noter and drone play, you only play notes, you fret the notes only on the melody string, not across all 3 courses.
Yep. Right. No chords.
Well, there are chords, but they're not finger chords. They're what we call drone chords.
Right.
Because you have 1 note and 2 drone notes.
Mm-hmm.
3 notes or more make a chord, as long as it's not discordant. So you have the melody and 2 drones notes that play. They hum, as I always say, they hum along behind the melody. They help fill in things. And if you're not going to fret the middle drone and you're not going to fret the bass string, there's no need to have frets under them. And the mountain folks were, to put it politely, frugal, okay? Like the frugal gourmet used to be frugal, not cheap. They were frugal. They used what they had, and they did use fence wire sometimes, wire, not staples, to make the frets. And they used a couple of pair of pliers or a vise and a hammer and to make their frets. And they didn't do any more work than they absolutely had to.
Right.
Relatively easy to drill 2 holes and then hammer a staple into those 2 holes. It was a whole lot easier to do that than it was to cut saw slices all the way across. And those saw slices had to be a certain thinness within about 1/4 of a millimeter.
Mm.
And the other thing is, these instruments were invented long before what we call the mushroom fret. If you look at a standard, like on your McSpadden, if you look at the McSpadden frets on edge, if you show people the edge of the fretboard like that, they might be able to see it. There's a tiny slice going down into the wood, and then the top, the part you're fretting, is actually wider than the stem of the mushroom. That's why we call them a mushroom fret.
Interesting.
And then the stem of that mushroom has a bunch of little spikes on it that dig into the slot, and that's what holds it in place.
Yeah.
So that type of fret didn't come along until the mid to late 1800s. And then it came along in the big cities like New York and Paris and places like that, not Peep and Holler, Kentucky, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, And sorry about that, Kentucky folks. That's a bad accent, I know. But the folks in the hills and hollers, they couldn't run out to the hardware store and buy this neat stuff. And there was no Amazon, no internet. At best, there was a Sears and Roebuck catalog, but you couldn't buy bits and pieces very readily.
Yeah.
And so they made do with what they had.
Absolutely.
Their strings didn't come in a little package labeled Dulcimer strings. Their strings were banjo strings because that's what there were.
Mm-hmm.
Guitar strings were too big. violin strings were made out of silk. And but banjo strings were just right, as Mama Bear said. So anyway, starting to lose it here. My, that's the story with the strings and the frets all the way across. It was a matter of only doing as much as you needed to do, not going out of your way. And that's another thing that when you start to look at the old dulcimers compared to the new ones, the finish on those old dulcimers was not like a piece of modern furniture, kind of lose yourself in the depth of the 700 layers of finish on them. It was black paint, or it might have been one of the most common finishes was boiled linseed oil, and that's what Bobby uses when he makes his. They take boiled linseed oil and they mix it with spirits.
Right.
Spirits could be booze, or it could be white spirits, which was another sort of thing. And they mix the two together and make a varnish.
Mm-hmm.
This real varnish made from, or shellac, was, again, hard to find in the hills and hollers. You had to buy a 5-gallon bucket at the minimum, or a block. If you wanted a shellac, you bought a block about that big of shellac, which was melted down insect bodies, crushed insect bodies.
Oh.
Shellac comes from a bug. There are these red insects, and the bodies are crushed and then mixed in with, I forget, wax or something like that, and then melted into spirits, and that's what makes the red color. It's one of the earliest kinds of wood dyes, but it also acts as a hardener on the surface. So anyway, they used what they had available. There are dulcimers that have been found that had no finish on them whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason we were able to find it in playable condition, or in at least museum condition, was that they'd been kept indoors, didn't get rained on. So the other finish that I like to use personally is tongue oil, which comes from a nut similar to a macadamia nut. Only tongue nuts will kill you. If they're poisonous. But macadamia nuts make a wonderful oil by themselves. They're crushed up. But the same thing holds true with the tongue nut. They grind it up and crush it and squeeze it, make this tongue oil, which sets up almost like polyurethane.
Oh, wow.
But it's all natural. It only takes about 4 coats to make a reasonably nice, not too shiny. This one is done in tongue oil. It's not real shiny, but it's not real flat, semi-gloss or satin, as they say.
Yeah.
So there.
Well, I know people in the group had some other questions about the different types of heads.
Okay.
So I know, like, my McSpadden comes, and I'll just show people quick, and then you can talk about. So the McSpadden here comes with a flat head,
right?
And then my Gatlinburg one has the scroll head,
right?
And people were wondering if that had anything to do with noter style or just preference.
No, let me see the underside of that. Is that a bottomless, or does it have a bottom to the scroll?
Bottomless.
See, this is bottomless.
Open.
See, that's the one thing Uncle Ed Thomas never figured out, was that if you cut through all the way on, I think Vanessa was one that was talking about, or somebody was talking about why that scroll heads are so much harder to restring. And they are, if your scroll head is like this and doesn't have, because the string goes down, hits that bottom, and then you need a pair of needle nose pliers to fish it around and through and back around again.
Okay.
If the tuning head, the scroll head is set up like yours is.
Yep.
You rotate the the tuner shaft so the hole is up and down.
Yep.
And then you push it through all the way down to the bottom and come all the way back up. And it makes it so much easier.
Okay.
That was one of the, I'll call it one of, it wasn't really a post-revival or revival era invention because some of the old timers did cut them all the way through. But that is an important thing to look for if you're going to buy a scroll head, is make sure whoever does it makes it with so that there is it's just two sides and it's
Right.
open all the way through.
Okay. And oh, and we lost him, friends. We lost him. I look forward to finding him again and finishing this interview. Friends, God bless you and keep you. May make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the good Lord bless you. Goodness.